Hello, welcome to today's edition of Hope and Helpful Families in West Virginia. My name is Reverend Matthew Watts. I'm here along with my co-host, Ms. Christy Day. And today we're going to be talking about what we have described as being a crisis in West Virginia's African-American communities as we look at some of the problems facing the various African-American communities in West Virginia. Christy, welcome again to the show.
Thank you very much. We do have a lot to talk about, a lot on our plate today, but some people may not have known that there's a segment of our population, not only here in the state, but nationally, that's in crisis. So this may be a surprise to a lot of people to hear you say that.
Well, it may be a surprise because a lot of people don't look at a lot of the demographic trends and a lot of the data that is issued by the census and by other think tank organizations. But when you look at the specific social indicators, and if you look at how they're impacting the African American community, I think that it is reasonable to conclude that there is a crisis. And when you look specifically at West Virginia, and in light of the fact that blacks only make up 3.1% of the state's population, yet they're overrepresented disproportionately in some of the areas that are negative, way out of proportion, I think it's reasonable to describe it as a crisis.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about the criminal justice system in our last couple of shows and some of the issues that are going on there and some solutions. However, much of what we're talking about is directly impacted by what's been outlined as an educational crisis and some things that are going on. So it's affecting African American children and families at a very young age because of the way that they're being typecast in our educational system.
You know, that's correct. I think most of our viewers would agree that in our society, education is the key to upward mobility. And a very sophisticated, high-tech information society, education is really the ticket out of poverty and to self-reliance and independence. And so if there is a segment of our population that is not performing on par with the national standards, state standards, and the rest of the population, then they're going to be placed at a sided disadvantage. And we think that that is a problem that's affecting many African-American youth in West Virginia. The Office of Civil Rights, the U.S. Office of Civil Rights, came into West Virginia and audited several school systems. And both Kanawha County and Raleigh County were cited by the U.S. Office of Civil Rights for the overrepresentation of black youth in special education, learning disabilities, behavior disorder, mild mentally impaired, etc., and the underrepresentation in the gifted program. And so that is a signal that there may be a problem and that these youth will be at a sided disadvantage when it comes to competing for employment opportunities.
Were you surprised by the response? I remember when that article came out, and it was shocking to me, as I'm sure it was shocking to a lot of people. But were you surprised that it didn't create kind of the tidal wave of response, that it just didn't happen in our communities? Were you surprised by that?
Well, I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. There's often a tendency, in our state, because blacks do make up such a small percentage of the population, for people to not look as closely at the impact of situations like this, maybe as they should. And so I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed because I had hoped that many people would realize that even though it affects the African American community in a real, decisively negative way, but it is not limited to the African American community. And so there are many youth, particularly poor youth, who are facing the same challenges, both black and white. So the problem is much larger than just being restricted to African American youth, but it is manifested in a more profound and pronounced way because blacks do live in communities, for the most part, that are heavily African American populated. And so what we're suggesting is that we should respond to this not merely because it's African American youth, but because it is youth in general. And African American youth in some situations are in much worse off much worse off than other youth.
Now, if you would, just kind of break this down to very, very basic and general terms in terms of what's going on here. What we're saying is, and what the report has said, is that when you're putting kids on an equal playing field, that say if they had the same kind of situation in the classroom, one would be more likely to be placed in special behavior classes as would their white counterpart, or if they are poor young people, then they would be more likely to be placed in that same situation than those who may be in a middle class. Is that what we're saying?
I think that is accurate, that a poor youth, black or white, is much more likely to be placed in special education than a non-poor youth, and that a black youth is much more likely to be placed in special education than any other youth. That's an accurate assessment there. And here in Kanawha County, they've been doing some things to try to address that and looking at how they're doing assessments and who's been referred into special education to make sure that what may be a behavioral problem, what may be a cultural disconnect, the teacher unable to really relate to the young people, which may be resulting in a referral to special education when maybe that shouldn't be taking place. And we've already seen in Kanawha County as a result of these efforts headed by Dr. Ron Doon and his staff, and I commend them on that they have identified black youth who for some reason had not been referred to the exceptional or the gifted program, even though they had tested high on the test or they were performing in an outstanding way in the classwork. But for some reason, they were overlooked in the process. So on the one hand, blacks are much more likely to be referred into special education than their white counterparts, and poor youth than the middle class counterparts. And blacks are much more likely to be excluded from the gifted exceptional programs, even when they have the credentials and the ability to perform at that level.
Well, that's what's difficult to understand. I mean, if you put people on paper, black and white on paper, and it says that this is the cutoff. If you do not achieve above this standard, then you will not be placed in the special achievement classes. And you do. I mean, you've tested there, you've scored there. Then what's the mystery? I don't understand why they're not going there.
I think the reason they're not getting into the exceptional, the gifted programs is because someone has to refer them to be tested. Mm-hmm. And so that would have to be a teacher, most likely, who would be observing their performance in the classroom on a daily basis and say, I'm going to refer this student to be tested for the gifted program. Unfortunately, in many cases, the parents may not be aware that the program exists or how the students are referred in, so they cannot make that request. And so it is the teacher that will be making those referrals, and for some reason, many teachers simply were not referring the black students to be tested.
So just because you have the score doesn't mean you're automatically referred?
No, what I'm saying, you have to be referred to take the test.
That's what, so we're saying the same thing?
Yeah, we're saying the same thing. So if you're not referred, you don't get to take the test.
Okay.
And so then you can't score and be into the program.
As we move on, you spoke a little bit about achievement gaps, and we're talking about that, but I remember some articles that were in the paper. I mean, some high-ranking folks, even in state government, who had children, who they had to actually get in to be advocates for them to be included in that process. Is that what parents just don't, as you mentioned, are not understanding, is how much of an advocate you have to be for your child, even in the school system? You're
exactly right. I mean, we always say to parents that you are first and foremost the primary educator of your child. Parents teach their children more than anyone else will teach them in their lifetime. And they also have to be the _1 champion, the #1 advocate, and the #1 cheerleader. And so they got to go to the school, they got to read these materials that come to them in the mail, they got to understand where the opportunities are and how to access those opportunities to see that your children get the best opportunity that the school system avails to them. You know, on that achievement thing, that achievement gap, the thing that is alarming there is that when you look at on the standardized tests, the Stanford 9 test, 3-3-11, the 8th grade Explorer, and the ACT, SAT college entrance exam, particularly the ACT and the SAT, that is very important because financial aid and scholarships and grants are directly tied to the performance on the ACT and the SAT tests. And so in Kanawha County, for example, black youth are performing considerably lower than their white counterparts on those tests. And it will affect their ability to access certain grants. For example, the Promise Scholarship. On the Promise Scholarship, the criteria is you have to have a minimum of 3.0 grade point average in the specified courses, and a 21 score on the ACT or a combined 1,000 on the SAT to qualify. And so with that criteria, even though many black students have a very high GPA in the classroom, if they don't get the 21 or the 1,000 on the college entrance exam, they will not earn the scholarship. Even though they are college material, even though they can perform at the college level, because so much emphasis is given upon the test. And so now we're talking about a dollars and cents proposition where black youth are not going to be able to receive those scholarships.
I know that for parents, and you know, I have 2 children of my own, and I think I've heard you say before, parenting is not for cowards. So you definitely, so when you come home from work and you're tired and you're dealing with all these issues, that's one thing that you have to ingrain in parents, is that the work isn't done just because you clocked out at 5 o'clock. The work is sometimes just beginning.
Something just beginning. I mean, you have 2 children. I have 5 children and a grandchild. And I'm certainly not putting myself up as some paragon of virtue or some example, but there are times that my wife and I drive our weary souls into the bed at 11 or 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning because I have 1 child in college, so I'm helping her with her college work. She's staying home, and 2 in high school, and 1 in elementary school, you know, and I'm the guy who does all the math stuff, you know. And so I got to check the papers to help with the homework. It is a difficult proposition, but it's time well spent and a great investment. And we encourage parents to do all they can.
Now, as we move on to the criminal justice system, that's something that we spoke about in great detail when we talked about the overrepresentation of poor and of black youth in the criminal justice system. And we spent a couple of shows on that. But that, again, is contributing to this crisis that we've talked about also in the state.
Yeah, if you look at, there is a nexus. You know, you see the education crisis. If African-American youth and poor youth are not being educated well with our current system, then the probability of them ending up in the criminal justice system is much higher than it would be if they were getting quality educations and the skill set to enter into gainful employment. And so we see this manifestation in the African-American community with this huge overrepresentation of blacks in the criminal justice system at every stage: arrest, in the case of juveniles, referrals to the juvenile court, detention, incarceration, transfer to adult status, and so forth. 3.1% of blacks make up 3.1% of the state's population, yet comprise of almost 33% of all those people incarcerated in jails and in prisons. I mean, that is alarming. I mean, that's incredible that 3.1% of people could make up 33% of those in jails and in prisons, yet there's no real discussion, there's no venue to talk about this, what's caused and how do we address it and so forth. If it was the other way around, you know, if whites were being incarcerated at the same rates as blacks, we'd be building so many prisons and jails that everyone will be talking about it. And what we're saying is that it needs to be talked about as it is, because it's still a tremendous cost to our society. And we're also forfeiting the contributions that people could be making if they were working, if they were engaged in a positive way in the community.
We're going to move on here to the third crisis that you have outlined that's facing African Americans in West Virginia, and that's a healthcare crisis. Many of us know or have family members that have diabetes, you know, dealing with prostate cancer, although prostate cancer is something that the population as a whole deals with, but probably, and according to the numbers, definitely not in the numbers as that is affecting the African American community. Is this, again, the fact that we just don't have access to health care?
Yeah. I think that's part of it. I think there have been a number of national studies conducted that concluded that blacks don't have the same access to quality health care as their white counterparts, and those reports are documented. I think that's part of the problem. I think, again, it's tied back to education. If people have less education or less quality education, then their employment opportunities are going to be limited, and therefore the type of insurance that they have may or may not cover certain illnesses, and so preventive health care may not be something people are taking advantage of. And so blacks are affected disproportionately and die disproportionately from diseases like diabetes, like prostate cancer, like cardiovascular disease, that if identified early through preventive health care are treatable and people lives can be extended. So it's a combination of factors. and education is a key part of it, as well as lifestyle. And again, what I'm suggesting is this is another strand, okay, in this cord that is strangling the life of the African American community, yet there's not the type of dialogue and discussion around the issue that we should be having.
And when you talk about dialogue and discussion, one of the issues that you have mentioned here is the percentage of reported cases of sexually transmitted diseases. Now, many people who know you, Reverend Watts, know that you're not going to find a whole lot of ministers and pastors talking about sexually transmitted diseases, but this is an issue that you feel like needs some attention.
We have to talk about it because the sexually transmitted diseases numbers are going up. They're not going down. And so there's a lot of promotion about safe sex. It's been promoted nationally, statewide, in the community and so forth. Apparently people must not be listening, or maybe it's not the effective message that we should be articulating. Now, we will disagree with people here, and intelligent thinking people often disagree, and that's what makes our republic such a great republic. I think the right message that we should be sharing with young people is abstinence until marriage. It is the healthy alternative, and we should share that with young people and explain to them why it's a healthy alternative. But in light of the fact that we are where we are, we need to talk about the fact that the sexually transmitted disease numbers for syphilis, for gonorrhea, for chlamydia, they are going up. And they're creating some real problems for young people. And then when you look at the reported HIV and AIDS cases, again, blacks disproportionately affected. 18% of all AIDS cases reported are in the African American community. And we're 3.1% of the population. 38% of all HIV cases positive are in the black community. That ought to send a signal out there that we need to take a close look at this. I don't think that blacks are any more sexually promiscuous than the broader community. However, I think there may be some contributing factors, and I have suggested this in a presentation I made. I think that one of the things that might be contributing to the high HIV/AIDS numbers may be the fact that we have an influx of people from larger urban communities coming into places like Charleston, Beckley, Huntington, and so forth, where there's a much higher HIV infection rate. And so they're coming into the communities and getting with people here and transmitting the virus. And what I'm suggesting is that as we see a growing diversity in our population, as we see more interracial relationships, that this thing very well could spread to the broader community, and that we could be facing, you know, somewhat of a health crisis. And I don't want to mean to be an alarmist, but I think it's realistic, and it's not something that is not out of the question that it could happen. So we need to be talking about it. So openly, honestly, you know, with young people and their parents.
So you know that your phone's going to start ringing off the hook.
I know it's going to ring,
okay,
and I hope it does.
As long as we know that.
We want the dialogue.
But that is very interesting, and you know, just a commentary on that point. It's very difficult, just in channel surfing, for example, that you can escape the sexual overtures that are in our commercials, that are in the videos that are on, you know, the various channels. It's very difficult to escape that. So you take someone who's a hormonal, you know, 14, 15-year-old, and this kind of blows their mind when they see this. And then if there's no parental constraint on there also, then they're kind of left to their own devices to digest that information, and then kind of go out and explore the various things there are to explore in the community.
I mean, you're right. It's a tremendous challenge, and it's one that we as parents, we don't always win. But what I am suggesting is we must come together as adults in the community. The African proverb, it takes a whole village to raise a child. And so it's not just the parents, it's the faith community. It has to be teachers. It has to be people in the neighborhood. Everyone who's concerned about young people, we've got to come up with a script, and we got to be saying the same thing consistently to young people, supporting them and trying to encourage them to make better life choices, because it's their lives that are being affected.
How likely do you think that whole abstinence education is going to, how well do you think that's going to be received?
Well, you know, I am hopefully optimistic. You know, I believe that this is the most intelligent generation of young people that this country has ever produced. And I think that if you engage them in dialogue, in discussion and conversation, you know, showing them respect, respecting their position and their view, and being open and honest with them, that many of them will make good choices. Within the Hope Community Development Corporation, we have what we call an abstinence initiative, and we'll be launching it in probably about 30 schools in Kanawha County at the first of the year. A young man by the name of Greg Shavers will be heading up that initiative. I think you may know him.
I do
and
know
so
him.
we're excited about that, and we're going to try to weave it into all of our youth programs to let youth know there is an option. Abstinence is an option. It's the safest option. It's the most healthy option for you physically, psychologically, mentally, and so forth. And so we're going to see.
Right. And Greg Shavers, for those who do not know, is my husband. My better half, as most people know him. And the fourth component of this is the unemployment issue, and we have spoken a little bit about that. However, you know, when you can't provide for your family, you can't put food on the table, you can't help your mama who's worried about the utilities being cut off any day, it leads people to make some choices, and sometimes very bad choices.
There's a desperation, I mean, that really sets in. You know, poverty limits options. It limits options that you would have. If I have resources, then I can create options for my children, for my wife, and for myself. If I don't have certain financial resources, then my options are limited, and therefore my opportunities are limited. What we're saying to young people is that education is the way for you to create opportunities and options for yourself in the future. And so you may have to practice some deferred gratification now, a lot of sacrifice you're going to have to make now. But if you apply yourself to your education, then you will create options and opportunities for yourself. We live in the real world, and we understand the pressure that young people, black and white, are feeling to have material things. We understand that the underground illegal economy affords them opportunities to have instant access to money and resources. We try to engage them in conversation to realize that you've got to really think it through. Your life can be tremendously affected by wrong choice as a young person, and you can limit options and opportunities for yourself for the rest of your life. And that's really the bottom line. And so getting young people engaged in dialogue, creating dialogue like this so more people will start talking about it and see how this is all linked together. You know, poor education limits employment opportunities, which puts people in a position where they're much more likely, and I'm not excusing or condoning, but much more likely to be involved in criminal activity, which means much more likely to be incarcerated, therefore now limiting themselves even further to further education and employment opportunities. Their whole lives are affected, the lives of their children are affected, the community is affected. And so what we're trying to get people to understand is that we are all affected by what happens to the least that among us, that we pay a social cost monetarily through taxes and social programs, et cetera, and then we forfeit the contribution and the resources that these very intelligent and very capable people could be making to our society.
One thing that may be confusing when you talk about the unemployment rate is the reason for it, because I know just driving down the boulevard and seeing, for example, all the restaurants are going through the mall or the shopping center. It seems like everybody's hiring, particularly this time of year. So some folks may say, well, there are jobs out there, I see them. Why aren't the people that you're talking about taking advantage of those positions that are open?
Well, there are a lot of jobs out there. Many of those jobs pay minimum wage, and there's no shame or disgrace, you know, in working at a minimum wage job to develop skills and experience to improve one's marketability, you know, for other jobs. There are some people out there who don't have the skill set, the maturity, or maybe the social skills to really hold down employment because it simply has not been learned, unfortunately. And so we've got to try to help them to develop those soft skills, the discipline, you know, of getting up every day, being there on time when you feel like it, when you don't feel like it, to maintain employment. And that's part of a problem. There are many people that are taking these jobs. And these jobs are not easy jobs. They're difficult jobs. And you have many of these mothers who have been receiving public assistance and now with their contract, and they're trying to go out and take these jobs. And very often the schedules of these jobs change. So that means that they're not with their children as much. They're not there maybe when they get home from school. They may not be there at night when they go to bed. That's creating other stresses and problems for the families. And so it creates another set of problems. The other thing is that the economy is slowing down. There's an article in the newspaper this morning, as a matter of fact, in the Charleston Gazette newspaper about the slowdown in the economy and what impact that's going to have on the welfare reform initiative nationally. As the economy slows down, as jobs, companies are reducing jobs, then how is that going to affect those poor people who are trying to get into the job market? There are a lot of things that are happening out there, and yes, we do need to try to work at trying to connect people with the employment opportunities that are there.
Do you think that the events of September 11th, I mean, you deal with young people on a daily basis, has that changed some mindsets? Has that changed some attitudes? Have you found that it's had any effect?
With some young people it has, but unfortunately with the vast majority, I don't think so. I don't think that we have engaged them in this conversation and discussion the way they really need to be engaged, and how they really need to understand how this event will impact life as we've known it in this country. And what should their response be as a young person to really try to strengthen themselves and educate themselves so that they can be a better American citizen and contribute to the strength of this great nation. I just don't think so, Christy. I think that young people today are bombarded with so many messages, from the media. And so this almost is it's like another action thriller, It's like another movie that they would go to, where there's the good guys and the bad guys, and a whole lot of people get shot and a lot of people get killed, and most of the time the good guys win. And it's hard to get them to realize this is real life. And there are young people who are going into harm's way to defend the security of this country. And if they really need to be thinking about it, every time I speak to young people, I've been telling them one thing, is that if this conflict continues, many of you may find yourself going to a foreign country, to engage in military conflict. In a few years, many of you are going to be in a position where you're going to be voting to elect people who are going to make the policies to determine how we respond to these type of situations. Those are the type of conversations I think we need to start having with our young people. They need to be engaged at a much earlier age.
Well, that's what's interesting about that, and what we're talking about here is conversations and dialogues that are happening now will hopefully affect the future in a positive way, and that's one thing that you hope to see by having these kinds of conversations.
You're exactly right. We believe that if you come to the table with openness, honesty, to have dialogue, to bring facts to the table, not pointing fingers, not blaming this group or blaming that group, but objectively saying, let's see if we can define the problem. I think it was Kittering that said, a problem well defined is a problem half solved. And so what we're trying to do is define the problems affecting the African American community, the educational crisis, the criminal justice crisis, the unemployment crisis, the health crisis, to define these problems and then to bring people to the table to create partnerships to address them, to strengthen the community. That's our hope and our vision.
Well, and that's the vision that you're hoping will spread throughout our communities like wildfire also.
That's correct. Well, we're about out of time for the day. We'd like to thank you again for tuning in to Hope and Helpful Families in West Virginia. This is Reverend Matthew J. Watts and Ms. Christy Day. Thank you, and looking forward to seeing you next time.